Hello, everyone. My name is Maureen Folk, and I'm the Outreach and Program Coordinator at the Chapman Museum in Glens Falls. This talk is going to focus on one of the biggest industries in this region that led to substantial economic growth from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, and that was the logging industry. Logging has been a major industry in the United States as early as 1600. When this region was settled in 1762, a sawmill was one of the first buildings constructed in order to make use of the surrounding dense wilderness. In the mid-1800s, a burgeoning demand for lumber made this one of the most important industries in the United States and turned Glens Falls into the lumber capital of the world. This quote here on the slide says, in 1850, New York State produced more lumber than any state in the nation, 500,000 trees a year, or 1 billion board feet of lumber. Enough lumber was produced in this area each year to make a boardwalk 3 feet wide around the earth. Most of the logs came out of the Adirondacks area and were processed in Glens Falls, Warren County, New York. This area was known as the lumber capital of the world. The Adirondack area produced many lumber barons. Many used their wealth to build churches, canals, turnpikes, railways, great dams, hydroelectric plants, and enormous lumber mills. It's difficult to say when logging truly began in this region. Indigenous tree culling practices had been used for thousands of years by Native Americans, but those were disregarded when colonizers began working this land. Historical records indicate that logs have been rafted down the Hudson as early as 1758. But in 1800, we start to see some local population growth and land clearing increases. By 1813, the Fox brothers were the first ones to float individual logs down the river for industry. As the industry continued to grow, loggers from various backgrounds arrived in the Northeast for work. Loggers were primarily German, English, French Canadian, Scottish, or Irish. When the logging season began in the late fall or early winter, lumbermen would travel to the camps that they'd be living at for the next several months. Camps had only the essentials. There were no flourishes. Camps had a dining hall, an outhouse, root cellar, office, equipment shed, stables, and a blacksmith shop. Men lived in cabins. These cabins were typically 2 rooms. One was called a dog room, which was for sleeping, and the other room was the kitchen and dining hall. Cabins typically held 40 to 60 men with bunk beds lining the walls of the dog room. In some instances, 2 men had to sleep in a bed, but these cabins were bare bones and there were no windows, and for many years, the floors were just dirt. In 1900, this would finally change when they started to use wood floors in the cabins. In addition to the bunk beds, the only thing that furnished the dog rooms were wood stoves used to heat the space. This photo here is from Wanakena, New York, and that's up by Cranberry Lake. Because it was difficult to regulate with just wood stoves, these cabins were always overheated and had a foul smell. These circumstances meant that lice and bed bugs were common in this environment. So to combat this, lumberjacks would sprinkle their beds and their clothing with kerosene, and the straw in their mattresses was renewed every season. There were very few women working at the logging camps, but there was typically at least one, and that was the cook. It wasn't always a woman, but more often than not, it was. The cook on site might have been the wife of the camp clerk, or she was a widow, or she was an unmarried woman trying to support herself. She only needed to know how to cook some staples such as pork, beans, pancakes, tea, and coffee, but it was seen as a perk if she could cook beyond those staples. Cooks typically woke up between 3 and 4 a.m. to start breakfast, and the men had to eat by 5 a.m. Breakfast leftovers were packed up for lunch, and men also brought hard-boiled eggs with them to eat at lunch. They washed it down with a cup of tea or coffee that they would boil around a campfire while they were out working. Many loggers also had a sweet tooth, and so a cook who could make donuts, cakes, pies, or other desserts was often sought out. Loggers worked really long hours, and they needed sufficient nutrients to keep them going. So because of this, lumberjacks frequently refused to work at camps where the cooks were considered second rate or the servings were small. This made the cooks a well-respected member of the logging camp team. Lumbermen typically worked 14-hour days, 6 days a week. On Sundays, workers had the day off. They would use this time to bathe or play cards or just tell stories and relax. However, not all loggers used their Sundays to bathe. Some chose not to bathe at all during the logging season. And these living conditions were already difficult, and they were just kind of leaning into it. They received anywhere from $25 to $40 a month for working. There were different jobs for workers at logging camps throughout the season. One of the first jobs was to fell the trees. For that, they needed lumberjacks. Logging would really begin in the fall. Once the sap stopped flowing in the trees, it was easier to cut them. They started by cutting pine, spruce, and balsam primarily. Lumberjacks would work from 5 a.m. until 8 p.m., and an exceptional lumberjack could fell upwards of 100 trees a day, while a novice would typically average closer to 30. After the trees came down, boys called swampers would come in and clear the branches from the logs. Swampers were typically young boys around the age of 14. Most of the logs were peeled immediately after they were cut. These were typically the hardwood trees. If they were peeled, then they would float down the river better. Additionally, the logs being used for pulp had to be peeled. Logs left unpeeled would be peeled once they reached the mills downriver. However, some logs did keep their bark. Early on in the logging industry, hemlock trees were harvested specifically for their bark. It was used to tan leather, but at the end of the 1800s, there was a scarcity of hemlock, and new methods in tanning using tannins and chrome salts reduced the need for the bark from hemlock trees. Logging requires a number of different tools. Until the 1890s, lumberjacks used the double-bitted axe as their exclusive tool for cutting. In the 1880s, the crosscut saw was introduced and made it possible to essentially double the amount of trees that you could cut each day. But this tool wouldn't be adopted in northern New York until the turn of the century, so a bit later. Each log was cut here in the Adirondacks to a standard 13 feet. This was uniform, but it did prove to cause some trouble once the logs were floating downriver, which we'll talk more about later. So now the trees have been cut, they've been peeled, and the swampers have separated the trees for skidding by cutting off those extra branches. So now we'll talk about what skidding is, and that's the next step in the logging process. So there needed to be a way to transport the logs from where they were harvested down to the mills or down to the river. Early on, the solution was a log flume or a log chute. Flumes contained water and transported the logs using the flow of water, while chutes relied on gravity and friction. The chutes would also be greased to aid in the log's movement. In addition, a skidway was typically built. Skidways were a framework for the logs to be piled on for storage until they shipped. These platforms typically rested near a slope for easy transport. And this was because if these logs are resting directly on the ground, they're going to take in that moisture and they're going to start to rot. And so you want to lift them up off the ground. It was at this point in the process that logs would be marked with their various company logos, which we will talk more about later. By late January, enough snow would provide good traction for hauling those logs down mountain roads. Here in the Northeast, the logs were brought down on a sled to the river and piled onto the ice. Log sleds could carry thousands of pounds of logs. Sled drivers or teamsters would sit on top of the logs on the sled, while a few other men would walk alongside to help guide the oxen or the horses. The sleds also had brakes to help them with sliding, as some of these roads could be quite steep. Hauling logs over snow and ice was actually much easier than hauling them over land. So if the sleds began to skid, sand or hay would be used to slow or stop the sleds. So road monkeys were workers who took care of sections of the roads to maintain them for the horses. Some of the roads were actually kept iced intentionally so that the sleds moved easily along them. This is another task that road monkeys would handle. The horses even wore special shoes in the winter to help with the ice and snow. This was one of the reasons the camps needed to have a blacksmith shop to make those shoes for the horses, as well as other things. In instances where the horses transported the logs all the way down to the river, I have heard that sometimes the horses would be hauled back up on the sleds so that they wouldn't be too tired to keep working. The horses could transport 2.5 truckloads of logs per one horse load. Teamsters guided the horses and sleds carefully down these slopes to the river. And yes, again, the sleds did have brakes so that if sliding was happening, those sleds would not just run right into the horses. The horses were incredibly valuable members of the team, so they were often well taken care of. Once spring arrived, the river driving would begin. River runs really revolutionized the logging industry. From 1851 to 1929, over 5 billion board feet of timber came down the Hudson River to the sawmills at Glens Falls. After hauling logs down to the river in the winter, lumbermen did what was called banking. This is where they lined the logs across the frozen river so that when the ice melted in the spring, they easily slid into the water. Additional runoff from the snow would result in high moving water that was desirable for getting the logs started and getting them going downriver to the sawmills. But this fast-paced water was also dangerous, and the ideal river conditions for driving was more of a meandering river. River driving to Glens Falls took approximately 2 months, and the drivers were wet the entire time. Drivers primarily dressed in leather boots and wool clothing. Constantly being wet wasn't ideal, and pneumonia was common among drivers. While it may seem glamorous, based on photos, driving was an incredibly dangerous job. Drivers didn't walk along the shore and watch over the logs like shepherds and sheep. Drivers rode the logs downriver to keep pace with them. They would also use boats, but these came more into play when they needed to break up jams. Unpredictable water could throw drivers into the river. They could fall, they could hit their head on a log or rock. So it was dangerous. River drivers would typically pick a good log and ride it for about 2 to 3 miles downriver, often while casually smoking a pipe. Other drivers would choose to run the wood, which meant that they hopped around to different logs, and this would help to pass some of the time. River driving ended once it became dark outside. It was considered too dangerous to keep driving at night. The river driving camps were located about 6 miles apart, so each day the logs would move about that distance. You're probably wondering how they just stopped the logs at night so that they could rest. So before the driving season ever began, stream maintenance was done on the path that the river drivers would take to try and ensure a smooth ride for the logs that was free of obstructions. Of course, they can't predict every problem, so there were still obstructions along the way. Part of this stream maintenance included establishing what's known as flash dams or temporary booms on the river, and these would have been used for holding. These flash dams were also called driving dams, and they were used to control the flow of water so that the logs didn't rush all the way downstream. In the Northeast, it was common for drives to run 75 to 100 miles downriver. So stream maintenance was very critical to make sure that that 100-mile drive was successful. Cooks would also follow along with the river drivers. They did this to ensure that the drivers were eating enough during the day. Once the drivers left in the morning, the cook would travel along the shore with a few other employees and arrive at the next camp. Once the logs arrived at the camp for the night, the drivers would retrace the route and clean the river, ensuring that they have all of the logs that they started with, and they would retrieve the ones that got lost or stuck along the way. While they would do everything that they could to recover the logs, about 14 to 15% of the wood was lost in transport coming down the river. One of the other challenges drivers faced was fixing log jams. This picture here is from up in Colton, New York. Log jams were fairly common occurrences, and there was a short list of ways to fix them. There were known spots along the Hudson that would cause problems and result in jams. Two of these notorious spots included Glens Falls below Newcomb and the Big Bend below Blue Ledge near Deer Den. Drivers typically worked in groups of 3 when they went out to clear a jam. There was a bowsman, an oarsman, and a sternsman. When the oarsman rowed to the jam, the bowsman hooked his pike pole into the nearest log. You can see a pike pole pictured here. He would use the pike pole on the nearest log and pull the boat up close. The oarsman would jump out and hold the boat while the bowsman and sternsman went to break up the logs with their PV poles. Typically, the logs could be broken up using a PV pole. Now, the PV really revolutionized river driving. The spike at the end steadied the log and helped drivers to stay balanced. Joseph Peavy of Stillwater, Maine, invented the PV pole in 1858. Next to the spike on the PV was a hook attached to a pivot. This could be used to grab the log and help to load and unload the logs. Jams often broke suddenly when they did break, and at the first sign of loosening, the men had to really run and get back to the boat for safety. If the boat ended up getting caught up in the swirling logs coming out of the jam, it could be a lot of trouble for the river drivers. In cases where the log jam couldn't be broken up using PVs, they would have to resort to dynamite. A charge of dynamite would be submerged towards the front of the log jam, and the detonator was at a safe distance into the woods along the riverbank. Dynamite was always a last resort. It was dangerous, and it ultimately resulted in a loss of profit. Because of the serious risk involved, drivers were typically paid more than lumberjacks, and they also ate more, according to the cooks. So some of the best drivers were the indigenous Mohawk. This picture here was taken by Stoddard in 1880, and that is on the Racket River. Log drives typically took 60 to 100 days each spring to get the logs from their harvesting site down to the mills in Glens Falls. Once the logs arrived at the mills, the drivers would be paid in full. They often took that pay and immediately went to a bar downtown. One of the most renowned local lumbermen was a driver foreman for Finch Prine named Jack Donahue. Jack worked as a foreman from 1900 until 1940, and over those 40 years, only 3 river drivers were killed on the job. Like I said, this industry was incredibly dangerous, and so I wanted to mention him because as a foreman, he had very few people die on the job, and so he was an exceptional foreman. So now that the logs have moved from the forest down the river and they've arrived at the big boom, which we will talk about, they needed to be sorted. The big boom worked like a large holding bay. The logs would be released through a gate and they were sorted based on the company's mark that was added on the skidway. Every log that came down the river was given a mark with a log mark hammer. This was a tool that would impress the unique company mark into the wood. Lumbermen would mark the logs all over those end caps so that you could see who the owner was from any angle. Once they were sorted, they were moved to corrals and held until they were sent to a particular mill. Logs were somewhat vulnerable when they were being marked on the skidway. There was a subtle and sly way to steal logs from other companies, and this was done by something called overmarking. This meant that loggers could stamp the logs with an additional mark over an existing company mark to make it appear that the log was intended for a different company. Some of the company logos were quite simple, as you can see here. And so overmarking wouldn't be that difficult. Turning a circle into a sun would be a pretty simple overmark. So now that the logs have reached the mills in Glens Falls, we can cover some of the different companies that were established and the growing impact that the logging industry had on this region. In 1865, Jeremiah and Daniel Finch partnered with Samuel Prine to purchase the Glens Falls Company Mill and formed Finch, Prine and Company. In January of 1876, they also acquired the Wing Mill for $40,000, which is where Finch sits today. The purchase of the Wing Mill was made under precarious circumstances, as they had borrowed 75% of the purchase price. Local skeptics regarded them as overconfident young Americans, but as we now know, their risk would pay off. The company's primary goal was to supply wood for construction, but they also manufactured canal boats, lime, and the prized Glens Falls black marble. In 1880, Finch Prine purchased its first Adirondack land tract, which consisted of more than 13,000 acres. They quickly accumulated more than 100,000 acres of Adirondack forest land. Finch Prine had 12 lumber camps scattered across the Adirondacks. These camps all had phone lines back to their main offices in Newcomb. By 1892, Finch Prine was the largest lumber business on the Hudson River, and Abraham Wing's site by the falls continued to be a major base of local industry. New York State was seeing significant tax revenue from this industry and wanted to continue to encourage the expansion of the logging industry. The state also recognized the importance of the waterways as transportation for these logs. Because of this, they were designated as public highways for the purpose of floating lumber. The first to receive this designation was the Salmon River in Franklin County in 1806. The Racket River was added in 1810, the Black River in 1821, and the Grass River in 1824. The state also encouraged settling in timber-rich areas through an act in 1827, which would grant additional land to settlers who were going to establish sawmills. The state was really doing everything that they could at this time to maintain this industry. Early on in the logging industry in Glens Falls, the logs were sorted and corralled within small spar booms, but these regularly broke or were swept away in high currents. So in 1849, the sawmills in Glens Falls joined with the timber companies to form the Hudson River Boom Association. About 4 miles upriver from the falls at Glens Falls, they built a series of stone piers and a system of chain booms at the Big Bend in the Hudson. At each end of the boom was secured a heavy end piece by chains. According to a report from 1859, the boom was made of heavy hewn timbers, 4 of them bolted together raft-wise. The ends of the groups were connected by chains which worked over friction rollers to allow the boom to accommodate itself to the motion of moving water. The purpose of the boom was to prevent the logs from escaping further down the river. But in 1859, the big boom actually broke and the freed logs escaped all the way down to Troy, about 40 miles south. Besides this incident, the big boom did serve its purpose well, and it held logs for sorting until 1929. At one time, there could be 600,000 to 800,000 logs waiting to be sorted at the big boom. The big boom was built in this spot because the large curve of the Hudson created calmer waters, and it reduced the pace that the logs were flowing at. And so this was a safer way to stop the logs than if they're traveling on a straight and rushing part of the river. The individuals who made the most wealth from this industry were lumber barons. While lumbermen were living in the woods and working 14-hour days, lumber barons were collecting profits and living in cities. Lumber barons owned the tracts of land that were being logged, as well as the mills that processed those logs. Local lumber barons included Jones Ordway, William McEachran, Alonzo Morgan, Henry Crandall, and Augustus Sherman. Jones Ordway funded the first YMCA building on Glen Street that now houses Spot Coffee. Lumber Baron Augustus Sherman was at one time the richest man in Warren County. He was worth more than $2 million in 1884, which is the equivalent to about $59 million today. Sherman was the president of the First National Bank of Glens Falls from 1858 to 1884. This followed an adolescence of hard labor. By age 15, he was hauling horse loads of lumber to Albany, and by 19, he had owned his own lumber and grist mills. Built in 1884, the Glens Falls Senior Center is the former home of Augustus Sherman. Another lumber baron was William McEachran. Born in Schuylerville, McEachran worked as a tow boy on the Champlain Canal as a teenager. He then went on to become a lumberjack in the Adirondacks. In the 1860s, he moved to Glens Falls with his family. William McEachran was involved in many local businesses. He was the head of the Glens Falls Paper Company, a charter member of the YMCA, served as village president, and helped to build the Christ Church. Henry Crandall made his first $1,000 in the lumber industry by the age of 31. He worked for 10 years as a laborer in the woods. He would go on to establish a lumber business in Glens Falls with John J. Harris and James C. Finch. Crandall's monument with his log mark stands in Crandall Park. An interesting anecdote I came across while researching for this talk was that in the cement at the base of the monument in Crandall Park is a footprint. One of the workmen apparently asked Mr. Crandall why he didn't leave an impression of his hand or foot as a personal reminder of himself for future visitors. Crandall then promptly removed his shoe and sock, and the results are said to be visible in the cement. I haven't had time to verify this story, but I hope that it's true. Crandall made a significant amount of money in the lumber industry, but he was really a man of the community and gave most of it right back to Glens Falls. This is Crandall with his Boys Savings Club. By 1870, the logging industry is really ramping up as the railway is expanded. Glens Falls contributed to the 390 million wooden cross ties needed for the railway expansion. And this launched Glens Falls into becoming one of the wealthiest small cities in the nation. The local logging industry peaked in 1872, and in that year alone, 18 companies sent more than 2 million individual logs, totaling more than 213 million board feet of lumber to the sawmills in Glens Falls. After being sawed into lumber at the mills, most of the lumber made its way to Troy or Albany via canal boats, where the docks lined with lumber would make their way to New York City or further west on the Erie Canal. The feeder canal, which opened in 1832, really opened the door for Glens Falls to reach these new markets and to transport cargo, including lumber and paper. Speaking of paper, this was another significant industry in Glens Falls that was a result of the booming logging industry. By the late 19th century, it wasn't board for construction that was the hot commodity, it was paper. In 1898, 17 mills along the upper Hudson merged and led to the formation of the International Paper Company. The Hudson River Pulp and Paper Company was one of those mills, and it was recognized as one of the largest producers of newsprint in the world at the time of the merge. By 1901, American Wallpaper in Glens Falls switched names and became Imperial Wallpaper. Imperial would go on to produce its own pigments, which would eventually be used in paint and textiles, as well as wallpaper. By 1904, Finch, Prine, and Company started to produce specialty papers for books, wallpaper, and magazines. Some of those magazines included Reader's Digest and TV Guide. The Glens Falls paper industry continued to rise from the early to mid-1900s, and Leland Paper was founded in 1951. This picture here is from inside Finch Prine's paper mill from 1910. For paper to be produced, the mills needed pulp logs. Pulp mills preferred the wood to be cut short, and so the 4-foot pulp sticks gradually replaced the 13-foot saw logs, which made river driving actually more difficult. The 4-foot logs weren't as steady in the water, and this resulted in more challenges for river drivers. In its prime, the lumber industry reached beyond the borders of the United States. Excess lumber was also exported to England and Ireland. England especially valued this import as well as other raw goods from America, since Britain had little to no lumber after centuries of overlogging. The logging industry slowed down here in Glens Falls in the early 1900s. From 1930 to 1950, Finch Prine was the only company still running drives, and that was because they continued to own land tracts in close proximity to the river. River driving officially came to an end in 1950 when Finch Prine ran their last drive, and the big boom on the Hudson closed by 1952. Evidence of a once great industry can still be seen as the cement pylons in the Hudson River remain standing and visible even today. At its peak, there were over 55 sawmills in Glens Falls, Hudson Falls, and the Corinth areas of the Hudson River. Obviously, logging is still done today. Our reliance on products made from wood is still very prevalent, but today guidelines and regulations ensure that logging doesn't result in mass deforestation here in the United States. And river driving is no longer an important stage of that process. The logging industry was profitable and hugely important for the growth of the Northeast through the mid to late 1800s, but it resulted in a decimated landscape. Environmentalist George Perkins Marsh understood the dangers of deforestation and wrote, "We have now felled forest enough everywhere. In many districts, far too much. Let us restore this one element of material life to its normal proportions and devise means for maintaining the permanence of its relations to the fields, the meadows, and the pastures, to the rain and the dews of heaven, to the springs and rivulets with which waters down the earth." He wasn't the only person to notice that this region needed protection. Since the Adirondacks are home to the headwaters of several important state waterways, including the Hudson, the state began the process of setting aside land for public use and protection. By 1872, the State Park Commission was established and legislation passed 11 years later for the preservation and conservation of the Adirondacks. By 1892, the New York State Assembly established the Adirondack Park, and Article 14 stated, "Such park shall be forever reserved, maintained, and cared for as ground open to the free use of all the people for their health and pleasure, and as forest lands necessary for the preservation of the headwaters of the chief rivers of the state and a future timber supply, and shall remain part of the forest preserve." Even after environmental protection, logging continued in the Adirondacks, but logging remains a necessary part of our economy, and byproducts from this process are still needed across the globe. Glens Falls' success as a village and then as a city from the mid-1800s to early 1900s is a direct result of the importance of the logging industry.